Mrs. Murray again, and we're going to look at another poem from the anthology. Remember what I said last time, this is for paper 2 of your literature exam. You'll have one poem on the paper that will be printed for you, and the other one that you compare with it, because it's a comparison task, you will have to remember. And the most important thing is going to be getting the right pairs of poems together. So what we're going to look at in this lesson is Exposure, which has been written by Wilfred Owen. Okay, so before we start looking at the poem in detail, let's do a quick do now activity. This is all sort of information that you've just been given previously. What does the word remains mean? What's alliteration? What is an emigrant? What is colloquial language? And what's a stanza in poetry similar to in prose? Give yourself 5 minutes to jot down those answers and then I'll go through them with you. For the answers to the do now activity, remains are the parts left over after other parts have been removed or used or destroyed. So think about the poem that we just looked at in the last lesson and you'll see how that was relevant and why the poem was called Remains. Alliteration is the occurrence of the same letter or sound at the beginning of adjacent or closely connected words. For example, round the ragged rock, the ragged rascal ran. Okay. Emigrants are people who've left the country of their birth to settle elsewhere in the world, like in the poem The Emigre. Colloquial language is the language used in ordinary everyday speech, so the way that we speak to each other. So remember that when we looked at Remains, there was a lot of colloquial language in that poem because it was reflecting how the soldier speaks, and a stanza in poetry is similar to a paragraph in prose. The next slide, I've got some pictures that are taken from the First World War. They depict soldiers and the impact of life in the trenches. So I want you to look at these images and I want you to think, apart from being in war, what else the soldiers had to deal with other than just the enemy. How might the soldiers have been feeling during the years they served during World War One? And what should they have been more wary of, the enemy or the weather? So have a look at these 3 pictures and think about what it shows us that life was like in the First World War in the trenches. Now, hopefully you've looked at these pictures and started to create a certain impression. In the first picture, you can see that there's deep, deep, heavy snow. The men's uniforms wouldn't have been good enough to deal with the coldness of the weather. We know from what we've been told that there probably wasn't enough big coats to go around. Many of the soldiers had ill-matching boots. So it wasn't just the enemy, the Germans, that was the problem. It was the weather as well. The pictures in the middle are hands that have been affected by frostbite. So that's something that happens to the human body when somebody gets very, very, very cold. And it always attacks hands and toes and feet. And you can see what's happening there. Once they've been frostbitten, the hand or the finger dies and it goes black. And eventually the person that's suffering from frostbite will lose that particular part of their body because it will just go rotten. So that was another thing that the soldiers had to put up with. And I think in the very last picture, again, we've got the extreme weather conditions, but you can see there wasn't much room in those trenches and there was nothing really like facilities there. But this is where the soldiers were living for days at a time when they were on the front line. I don't want you to spend any more than 5 minutes on this activity. Exposure is by Wilfred Owen. I'm going to read this contextual information with you, and then I want you to reduce the information that you've got here into 4 bullet points to help you understand what influenced his writing. As you read, consider whether any of your inferences from the activities on the previous page were correct. Exposure is a poem written by the English poet and soldier Wilfred Owen. Owen wrote Exposure in 1918, but it wasn't published until 1920, after Owen's death in World War One. Like most of Owen's poetry, Exposure deals with the topic of war. Exposure specifically focuses on the sheer monotony of daily life for many soldiers, as well as the harsh conditions that they must endure, that is, to be exposed to, even when not on the battlefield. This suffering is made all the more devastating given the fact that, in the speaker's mind, War seems to accompany nothing on a larger scale, which is an idea that Owen frequently puts forward, espouses in his work. World War One began in 1914, and at first it was predicted that it would end swiftly. However, as both sides dug trenches across France and Belgium, the opposing armies became locked in a stalemate that neither side could break. By the winter of 1917, both sides had sustained massive losses, and extreme cold weather made the misery even worse. It was said to be the coldest winter in living memory. The soldiers suffered from hypothermia and frostbite, and many developed trench foot, a crippling disease caused by feet being wet and cold and confined in boots for days on end. Owen and his fellow soldiers were forced to lie outside in freezing conditions for 2 days. He wrote, "We were marooned in a frozen desert. There was not a sign of life on the horizon and 1,000 signs of death. The marvel is we did not all die of cold." It was against this background that Owen wrote Exposure. What I hope that you got from the context in the previous the previous slide of the PowerPoint, was that the conditions were horrific. And what we need to understand, and the reason that this poem is so very, very important, it was written by a soldier. Wilfred Owen was a soldier in that war. He wrote this poem while he was in one of the trenches. So this is an absolute first-hand account. If you remember, the last poem that I did with you was Remains. And the poet, he wrote the poem based on a soldier's words, not his own experience, but a soldier's words. This, written by Wilfred Owen, is his own experience. It's something that he actually went through as a soldier, which makes it all the more powerful and affecting. So I'm going to read the poem out to you. As ever, with all of these poems, there's multiple kind of like bits of information out there for you. If you go onto YouTube, there'll be lots of tutorials, etc. So if you want to find out more about Wilfred Owen and about the poem, there's plenty of information out there for you. Right, let's read it through together. Our brains ache in the merciless iced east winds that knife us. Wearied, we keep awake because the night is silent. Low drooping flares confuse our memory of the salient. Worried by silent sentries whisper, curious, nervous, but nothing happens. Watching, we hear the mad gusts tugging on the wire, like twitching agonies of men amongst its brambles. Northward, incessantly, the flickering gunnery rumbles, far off like a dull rumour of some other war. What are we doing here? The poignant misery of dawn begins to grow. We only know war lasts, rain soaks and clouds sag stormy. Dawn, massing in the east her melancholy army, attacks once more in ranks on shivering ranks of grey. But nothing happens. Sudden successive flights of bullets streak the silence, less deadly than the air that shudders black with snow, with sidelong flowing flakes that flock, pause and renew. We watch them wandering up and down the wind's nonchalance, but nothing happens. Pale flakes with fingering stealth come feeling for our faces. We cringe in holes, back on forgotten dreams, and stare, snow-dazed, deep into grassier ditches. So we drowse, sun-dozed, littered with blossoms trickling where the blackbird fusses. Is it that we are dying? Slowly our ghosts drag home, glimpsing the sunk fires, glozed with crusted, dark red jewels. Crickets jingle there. For hours the innocent mice rejoice. The house is theirs. Shutters and doors all closed. On us the doors are closed. We turn back to our dying. Since we believe not otherwise can kind fires burn, now ever suns smile true on child or field or fruit. For God's invincible spring our love is made afraid. Therefore, not loath, we lie out here. Therefore we're born, for love of God seems dying. Tonight this frost will fasten on this mud and us, shrivelling many hands and puckering foreheads crisp. The burying party, picks and shovels in shaking grasp, pause over half-known faces. All their eyes are ice, but nothing happens. So now have a little think about this. What do you think is happening in this poem? And can you explain your ideas in no more than 4 sentences? Think about the soldier. Think about that repeated phrase, nothing's happening. It's really not what you would imagine in a war, but for great, huge, periods of long time, nothing happened. They weren't constantly shooting at each other. They couldn't do that. It would have been too expensive. They haven't got the ammunition for it. So it's not something that we imagine war to be like, is it really? That it was boring. But of course they were living on their nerves because they never knew when the next attack was going to happen or what was going to come their way. Think about his descriptions of the weather. What's killing them in this poem? It's not the enemy, is it? It's the weather that's doing the damage. And I want you to also think, why do you think that Owen wrote this poem? What do you think his thoughts and his feelings were while he was writing it? Remember, he's describing to us a real experience, something that he actually went through himself. Why does he want to tell this story, do you think? Do you think the people back at home in 1914 to 1918 knew what the war was really like in the days before television and radio? Would they have known how the soldiers were suffering? So think about whether the idea might have been for him to educate people, to let them know what was going on. On this table here, which I'd like you to reproduce, we've got some of the vocabulary, the language from the poem, and we're going to start to try to think about what those words mean. So, for example, the first one has been done for you, merciless. That means to show no mercy. Our brains ache in the merciless iced east winds that knife us. And the word merciless suggesting in that last box, the wind is showing no mercy when attacking the soldiers. It's not bothered about the war and it will remain relentless. It doesn't stop, does it? It keeps going. It doesn't show any pity towards the soldiers. So I'd like you to have a look and find the word poignant, the word nonchalance, and the word shrivelling. Look those words up, look at the lines that they come in, and see if you can put in that last box what you think those lines are suggesting. Okay, why has the poet used those particular words? So let's go through those words and their meaning. The word poignant means to evoke a keen sense of sadness or regret. The poignant misery of dawn begins to grow. Dawn does not bring a sense of happiness or life, but rather a reminder that another day of war and suffering has ended. Normally we think of dawn as being the start of something good, don't we? It has quite positive connotations, but clearly in this instance, it doesn't. It doesn't bring anything better with it, does it? Because life for the soldiers doesn't get good. It's always desperate for them. So the next word that we've got here to look at is nonchalance. Nonchalance, that's how you say it. And what it means is that it's behaviour that suggests you're not interested or you don't care. And the quote from the poem was, "We watch them wandering up and down the wind's nonchalance." And once again, it's a personification of the wind, isn't it? The wind does not show any interest in the war or the suffering the soldiers are experiencing. It remains a brutal force, okay? So that's what the language is doing there. The next word that we've got to look at is shrivelling. And what that means, to wrinkle and contract, or to cause to wrinkle and contract, or to lose momentum, will or desire. And the quote from the poem was, "Shrivelling many hands." The soldiers are being impacted on physically and emotionally. The weather and the war are taking its toll on them. And this is the whole point of this poem, isn't it? That it's not just the war that's affecting the soldiers, it's the weather. Seems to be an even bigger enemy than the Germans. What I'll do now with you is go through the poem line by line. And so what you might want to do now is annotate your copy of the poem in the booklet that you've got, or in your poetry anthology if you've got that with you. We will go through this again in class, obviously, when we get back to school. So don't worry if we miss things. We're not going to like analyse every little word on it. This is just the first time that we're looking at this poem. It's dense. It's got a lot in it. It's complex. So we're not going to look at every single word, and do not worry about it. But look at some, I'm going to go through it, and I just want you to think and put some notes around the poem while we're going through it. So hopefully by the end of this lesson, you'll have a good understanding, at the very least, of what the poem is about, and what it is that the poet is trying to say to us about war. So, in the very first line, that word merciless, which we've just had a brief kind of chat about, haven't we? The connotations of the word, the suggestion that it's cruel and it shows no mercy, not the enemy, the weather. Highlight iced east winds that knife us. Owen has personified the wind. Why? What impressions does it give us about the weather? The idea that it's human by using the personification makes it sound all the more worse, doesn't it? Because it makes it sound as if the wind is doing this deliberately to harm the soldiers. Think about that word knife as well. It makes it sound cruel and damaging and hurtful, as if the wind is slashing at them. Line 2, the word wearied. What does that mean? Why would the soldiers be wearied? Wearied means tired. They're tired, aren't they? They haven't got any energy. They definitely weren't getting good food. And you can imagine that this conditions, this intense cold, would have really worn them down. Look at the next line. We've got silence, sentries, whisper, curious, nervous. Here we've got an example of sibilance. The S sound could represent whispering. Why? And how does that sound, that repeated S sound, that sibilance? It always has a kind of sinister effect, doesn't it? It makes it sound unpleasant. So look at these lines with me. This is the refrain on line 5 of the poem, repeated throughout. Why has Owen used this phrase? What is he saying about this? It's the lack of anything happening, isn't it? It's the boredom, it's the monotony that's actually getting to them, as ridiculous as it sounds. The word refrain means it's repeated. So it's the line that's repeated at the end of all of those different stanzas. Have a look at line 6 and highlight mad gusts. The poet has personified the wind again. Why? What does it suggest about the weather? Think about the word mad, that it's lost control, that it doesn't know what it's doing. The simile in line 7. What comparisons can we make between barbed wire and brambles? Consider the pain caused. Think about how violent and destructive barbed wire is, and brambles, that they can actually rip skin, can't they, and damage people. And line 8, look at the word incessantly. Okay, that means that it doesn't stop. So what does this adverb incessantly suggest about the noise of gunfire? I said to you that they're not being shot at repeatedly because they weren't, because there just wasn't enough ammunition for that to happen. But they would have heard the sound of gunfire constantly in the background, which would have made them think that their lives were, which they were of course, permanently in danger. Can you imagine the effect that would have had on a human being, that constant sound, reminding them that they're in a war zone? Okay, have a look at the phrase other war. What is this suggesting? More than one war? Highlight poignant misery. We've talked about that word on a previous slide, haven't we? And why has dawn been described like this? How would the soldiers feel at dawn? Remember what I said on the previous slide about dawn is normally a really positive idea, that dawn brings a fresh new day. But this very much suggests to us that every day is as miserable as the last. There is no hope, is there, for the future? Line 12, how does this represent the soldier's mood? How does he feel? And lines 13 to 14, dawn has been personified again. What does it suggest about the battle lying ahead of the soldiers? There's no positiveness in this poem, is there? Because the soldiers have lost all faith moving forward. Sibilance is used in line 16 to show the sound of the bullets tearing through the air. Why could the full stop there at the end be significant, do you think? Remember, in poetry, every piece of punctuation has been put there very deliberately. What does the full stop suggest is going to happen, do you think? Why has Owen in line 17 suggested that the bullets are less deadly than the snow? That seems like a really odd thing to say, doesn't it? That it's, again, this idea that it's the weather that is slowly killing them, their exposure to the weather that is doing all of the damage. Line 18, he's used alliteration in this line. What could this suggest about the snow, do you think? And then line 19, the word nonchalance. What does this word tell us about the weather and its attitude to human weapons? The weather doesn't care, does it? It's not bothered. It doesn't care. It doesn't care about what's happening to the soldiers. And that makes it sound even more dangerous. In 21, the snow again has been personified. What does it tell us about the plans it has for the soldiers? Think about this constant personification, and personification makes it sound like the weather is doing things deliberately. It has no soul, it has no pity for the soldiers. Look at that line, forgotten dreams. What does this metaphor symbolise? Remember how very, very young so many of these soldiers were. They signed up on a bit of a whim, really. They thought the war was all going to be over within a couple of months and they'd be back home. Their lives have been completely disrupted and spoilt and ruined, haven't they? Line 25, another rhetorical question there. What does it raise to you as you read that line? Line 26, our ghosts drag home. What does this line suggest about the soldiers and how they would eventually return home? Really think about that word ghosts. What's happened to somebody when they become a ghost? It's their lives that are over. Even if they get away from this dreadful war, they'll never be the same again, will they? They will be like ghosts. Their lives are over. Line 27, crusted, dark red jewels. What could this be a metaphor for? And why in the end line are the mice deemed to be innocent? Why are they rejoicing? Look at line 29. On us, the doors are closed. What could this line suggest about the soldiers? Imagine how they felt in this dreadful, dreadful place. And they must have felt that the world had forgotten them. They certainly felt that God had forgotten them when you look at line 33, that they were losing their faith. On us, the doors are closed. They've been left out in these dreadful conditions, and it must feel like nobody cares anymore. Line 30, does this line imply any choice for the soldiers? Line 31, Owen no longer believes that fires are kind or bring a sense of comfort. Why not consider the trenches? There is no comfort in the trench. There is no warmth. And I also think he believes that there's no chance of going back home to warm fires and comfort. Highlight and look at line 32, sun's smile. What does this personification suggest? Think about the connotations of the word smiling. And in that last line, that line 33, in this line, Owen shows that his faith is breaking and he's struggling with his religion while he's at war. He and all of the other soldiers would have been quite confirmed Christians at this point in history. And it's well documented that many, like Owen, felt this way, that they started to lose their faith. They found it very hard to believe in a God that could have put them in such dreadful, tragic circumstances. Line 34, the soldiers are born to die. They are lying, waiting death to take them to a new life and be reborn. It symbolises the sacrifice made during the war, and I think it's also symbolic of the fact that they don't feel that they could possibly survive this terrible situation. Line 35, and once again, Owen discusses losing his faith. And I think we can understand why he might be feeling this way. You would feel like God had forgotten you. Line 36, the word fasten. What does it suggest about the frost? Fasten, something that fixes itself to something else, doesn't it? The image shrivelling. How does this depict the soldiers in line 37? That they are shrinking, that they are damaged, they're shrivelling away. Highlight the burying party. Like, why is this ironic? Now, a burying party was a legitimate thing. It was the group of soldiers who would have to leave the trenches and go out onto no man's land with shovels. What they were trying to do was get back the bodies that had been shot in no man's land and then buried. The word party is the one that seems so very wrong, doesn't it? Because a party literally just means a group of people, but it's a word that we associate, don't we, with celebration. So there is an irony, isn't there, in that there's no celebration in what these poor soldiers had to do. Highlight half-known faces. What image does this convey? They became like brothers almost in these times when they were in the trenches together. But these weren't people that they knew particularly well. I've got a link for you here. So it'll take you to a video by a teacher called Stacey Ray on YouTube. In this video, she takes you through the poem, and you could make notes as you go along. If you're aiming for a grade 6 in literature or above next year, watch this video because it's got some really, really good analysis in it. The ideas she discusses, are complex, but these are the kind of things that will really help you. Now, you've read the poem and we've gone through it. First time you've come across this poem, so there's lots and lots of ideas there. Don't worry too much if you're not sure yet. Obviously, we'll be going through this in lessons when we get back to school as well, won't we? Try and think of 3 ideas of why this poem is called Exposure. And the poem appears in the Power and Conflict cluster of your GCSE anthology. Where are power and conflict seen in exposure? Try and avoid the obvious, like it's set during World War I. Think about the power of nature. It's nature that's killing these soldiers, isn't it? He doesn't even really talk about the enemy. The enemy is the weather. That's what's killing them. And that's a really strange idea, isn't it? In a poem that's all about war. The really sad thing about all of this is as well that Wilfred Owen, we know, was there. We know he wrote this when he was in one of the trenches and he was at war. He didn't survive this war. And he was only a young man when he passed away. He got really near to it. I think it was about a week before the war was actually finished. And that's when he lost his life. So very, very sad. Last slide, guys. Thank you so much for sticking with it. There's another website for you here. You can read through some of the diary entries from Wilfred Owen. You might be able to see some inspiration for why he wrote the poem Exposure, and it will certainly help you to understand what the soldiers went through and how very, very hard the conditions were. Like I said, guys, it's a complex poem. There's a lot in it. It's the first time you've come across it. So well done for sticking with it and coming through to the end of the PowerPoint. I think this is an amazing poem. I think it's so desperately sad and very, very powerful. I hope you enjoyed it too.